Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Texera. I teach in the Department of Sociology, and as usual, we are excited about this program today. And I think one of the things I love about this series that we're doing, it's so diverse. You know, we can talk about history, we can talk about the criminal justice system and history, and that's what we're combining today with our talk on an incident that occurred in Hawaii or Hawaii a century ago. And if you're like I am in school, we did not hear about this incident. So Dr. John Okamura is going to enlighten us today, and we're very, very excited. As usual, though, we want to acknowledge the land on which we are sitting. And so with that, we recognize that California State University, San Bernardino, sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, and we will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Thank you. You will see several faces on our screen right now. One is our former dean, our Dean Emerita, Eri Yasuhara, and our community representative of the West Side Action Group, Stan Futch, who will be sort of fielding questions at the end of Dr. Okamura's talk. And so with that, I want to so proudly recognize our former Dean of Arts and Letters, Dr. Eri Yasuhara.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that very kind introduction. I'm very, very happy to have been asked. I'm very honored to have been asked to participate today. And I will go ahead now and introduce our speaker. And it's my great honor today. Let's see, I just want to move something on my screen. I don't think you can see it on your screen, which is great. I don't need to screen share. It's my great honor today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jonathan Okamura, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. He describes himself as a fourth-generation Japanese American born and raised on Maui. But I was very happy to see in his CV that he also has strong ties to California, where he attended high school and college in the 60s. His BA is from the University of Southern California in anthropology and mathematics. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of London in 1983. His dissertation was based on fieldwork that he conducted with Filipino immigrants in the Kalihi inner city area of Honolulu. Motivated by a keen desire to foster racial and ethnic equality, particularly for aggrieved minorities in Hawaii and elsewhere, he has spent his professional career teaching courses, conducting research, and publishing numerous articles and books on race and ethnicity in Hawaii and the continental United States. He has regularly made himself available to the news media to discuss race and ethnicity issues, and has participated on local radio and television discussion programs and in community forums on current issues. He retired last year, but remains a very active, engaged public scholar and activist, continuing to serve on the UH Mānoa Commission on Racism and Bias. He joins us today from Hawaii, where I'm sure we all wish we were, to talk about his latest book called Raced to Death in 1920s Hawaii, Injustice and Revenge in the Fukunaga Case. And before I do turn it over to Dr. Okamura, I just want to encourage everyone to write your questions in the Q&A field, and we will be getting to those at the end of Dr. Okamura's presentation. So without further ado, Dr. Okamura.
Okay, thanks very much, Judy, for that fine introduction. Let me share my screen now so that you can see the title of my book that I'll be discussing. Is that okay?
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let me begin with some acknowledgements. I'd especially like to thank Roby Madrigal and the other organizers of my lecture today for inviting me and setting things up for me so very well. And also thank those who are zooming in this time for my presentation. It is based on my book with the same title, which was published about a year and a half ago. The Fukunaga case is about a Japanese-American 19-year-old, Miles Fukunaga, who brutally killed a 10-year-old white boy. Sometimes in my talk, I may use the term haole, the Hawaiian term for a white person, because I commonly use that term because of its significance in Hawaii. And my focus is on the racial significance of this case. What does the Fukunaga case tell us about how race operated in Hawaii as the leading organizing principle of social relations in the 1920s and for much of the pre-war II period? I like to start my discussions about the case with a picture of Gil Jamison, because he was the real victim of this crime committed by Fukunaga. I tend to emphasize Fukunaga as the victim of racial injustice, but we need to keep in mind that Gil, dressed here as he was at the time of the killing, was the one who had to lose his life as a result of what occurred. Fukunaga was captured 4 days after he committed his crime on September 18, 1928. This is his mugshot. He was regularly referred to as a boy by the press, the prosecutors, the judge, because of his slight stature, 5 feet tall, maybe 120 pounds. I'll begin with some background about Fukunaga's life. Miles was not his real name. He was born Yutaka, but he took the name Miles, like many Japanese American boys and girls did during this time, as a way to express an American identity during this period when Japanese Americans were viewed as disloyal to the United States. He was born on a plantation community in Kauai as the chonan, which means he was the oldest son in the family, and therefore had the greatest responsibility for helping his parents raise their, well, with the financial support of bringing up 6 younger siblings who were born after him. The Fukunaga family moved to Wailua on this island, Oahu, in late 1924, and Miles finished school in the 8th grade in June of the following year, 1925. His teachers described him as a very good student who liked writing, which he did for the school newspaper, and also he liked to spend his time reading. He spent the summer picking pineapple on the north shore of Oahu with his father, and then the family moved to downtown Honolulu in September of 1925. He found work very quickly at the Queen's Hospital, very near to where they were living, and went through a series of jobs, initially hospital orderly, elevator boy, messenger boy, then lastly office boy when he quit work in March of 1928. The reason he quit was he had been promised a $5 raise twice, but when it was denied the second time, he decided he would leave the Queen's Hospital. And he was receiving at that time $40 to 35 of which he turned over to his parents to help them raise their large family. The remaining $5 he spent on his own leisure time activities, going to the movies and buying magazines to read. He also spent a lot of his free time, which he had perhaps just one day a week, reading at the public library or at the YMCA. Now, Fukunaga would be captured 4 days after killing Gil Jamison on September 18th, a Tuesday. And in his confession to the police, which he quickly gave following his arrest, he said that not being able to continue with his education was the biggest disappointment in his life because he enjoyed school and he knew he was a good student while he was attending school previously. Miles, though, was very unhappy with his life at this time. He told the police, "I'm a lonesome boy. Books are my only friends. I have no friends." So after leaving Queens Hospital, he tried to kill himself twice. First by taking some medicines, which he stole from the hospital before he left. When that failed, then he tried to hang himself. And of course, that failed. I'm going to fast forward then to his conviction and death sentence, which occurred in October of 1928. Fred Makino, the publisher of the Hawaii Hochi newspaper, led a campaign for a new trial and a full psychiatric examination of Fukunaga. And he solicited contributions from the Japanese American community, $7,000, which was used to hire a new attorney for Fukunaga. And this attorney filed appeals of his conviction, initially with the Territorial Supreme Court, then to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, ultimately to the US Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. So these appeals delayed his execution until November of the following year when he was hanged. In these 4 letters he wrote, saying goodbye to his family and Catholic priests who had assisted him. He signed all of them James, which was his baptismal name after he converted to Catholicism shortly after being sentenced to death. He underwent, what I consider very dramatic religious transformation while he was in prison, reading the Bible every day, praying and speaking regularly with the chaplain at the Oahu prison. Following his hanging, a Buddhist ceremony was held for him at a Japanese mortuary in downtown Honolulu. Then his body was taken to a Japanese cemetery across town in a community, Moiliili, known to be a Japanese community center. And this is where he was buried that same day. His gravestone is very easily identified in the cemetery. It's one of the tallest, about 8.5 feet tall, made out of natural stone, as opposed to perhaps you can see in the background, the other gravestones are polished granite or marble. I believe this gravestone was contributed by donations from the Japanese community because Fukunaga's family was too poor to purchase such a very distinctive gravestone for himself. 5 days after his execution, the Japanese American community held this very large gathering on the grounds of the Japanese language newspaper, school rather, in downtown Honolulu. This gathering was organized by the Hawaii Hochi newspaper in order for Fred Makino and other speakers to give their last update on the Fukunaga case. Now, I believe they held this gathering outdoors because they knew there was no building that could accommodate such a large group of Japanese Americans, 6,000, as I had mentioned. So I see this gathering as a public protest on the part of Japanese Americans against the conviction and execution of Fukunaga. Let me turn to the circumstances of Gil Jamison's death. As I said, he was a 10-year-old who attended Punahou School No question, it was the most academically prestigious school in Hawaii at that time. It had been started in the mid-19th century by the missionaries for the education of their children. Barack Obama would graduate from Punahou School about 51 years later. Gil's father, Frederick, was president of the Hawaiian Trust Company. He came to Hawaii from Scotland in 1910. Gil's mother, Lulu, came to Hawaii in 1912 as a school teacher. In May of 1928, Fukunaga was still unemployed, staying at home, when a rent collector from the Hawaiian Trust Company came to collect $20 in overdue rent. First speaking to his mother, he spoke very little English, so Miles, overhearing their conversation, went out to speak to the rent collector. In his confession to the police, he spoke very bitterly about his exchange with the rent collector. He said, "How can we pay? We don't have any money. Why can't you wait?" And he told the police in his confession, he could not understand why a big company like Hawaiian Trust, I forgot to mention, Hawaiian Trust managed the leasing of the Fukunaga family, home rather. This is the reason for the rent collector coming from the Hawaiian Trust Company to the Fukunaga home in downtown Honolulu. So as a result of that encounter with the rent collector, Fukunaga said he developed a hatred against that company, which over time developed in a desire for revenge. So he, as he said, planned and planned that summer how he would exact vengeance against the Hawaiian Trust Company. His plan was to kidnap Gil, who he only knew existed in the morning of September 18th, 1928, when he called the Jamison family home and inquired if they had a young son and where did he go to school. So he subsequently called Punahou School and said he was calling from a hospital where Gil's mother had been taken after she was injured in a traffic accident, and they would be sending someone to pick Gil up at Punahou because his mother Lulu wanted to see him. So this is how Fukunaga was able to go to Punahou School and have Gil handed over to him by the school principal. He came in a rented taxi, which he then directed to take him to Waikiki, which was a relatively short distance away, perhaps 10 minutes away, and then proceeded to the back of the Seaside Hotel where he had been working that summer, and then bludgeoned Gil to death using a metal chisel. Captured 4 days later, Fukunaga willingly confessed his crime to the police. He gave 3 reasons for his crime. The first was he wanted to send his parents back to Japan. They spoke regularly about this desire, but their poverty meant that this was out of the question. They could not afford such a trip. They can't even pay rent. His second reason for killing Gil was to die, having failed in his 2 previous suicide attempts and given his very unhappy life. So as he said, this crime will have a double purpose. I will be able to obtain ransom money with which I will be able to send my parents back to Japan, and I will be able to die because I will confess after my parents have left to the police, and they will have me executed since I had failed in my own suicide attempts. The last motive he told the police was he wanted to exact revenge against the Hawaiian Trust Company because of that contentious encounter with their rent collector. Now, in planning and committing his crime, Fukunaga was very closely copying the well-known Leopold and Loeb murder case in Chicago in 1924. Leopold and Loeb were these very brilliant, very wealthy University of Chicago students who decided to kidnap a young boy 14 years old, also from a wealthy family. He was also copying a case in 1928 in Los Angeles in which Edward Hickman had kidnapped the daughter of a banker and also brutally murdered her. So Fukunaga, after killing Gil, sent a ransom letter to his father, Frederick, demanding $10,000 in ransom payment, the same amount as Leopold and Loeb. He also copied their letter that they had used when they sought a ransom payment from the victim's parents. So Fukunaga collected $4,000 of a ransom payment that evening from Frederick Jamison, and he immediately spent $5 on a taxi cab to take him back to this rooming house in downtown Honolulu where he was staying, and spending the money would lead to his arrest 4 days later because the serial numbers had been printed in the local newspapers in Honolulu. Now, I know your colloquium series is focused on race and policing. My concern is more the racial injustice perpetrated by the prosecution, the judge, and even Fukunaga's defense attorneys in this case. But I can mention that the police racially profiled Japanese American young men immediately because Fukunaga had showed up at Punahou School when he kidnapped Gil Jamison. So the suspect they were looking for was known to be a Japanese American. As a result, 19 Japanese American men who fit the profile, being of young age, were picked up by the police, questioned, and detained for several days before being released after Fukunaga was arrested. 2 of them were beaten. One of them was the former chauffeur of the Jamison family, the first person picked up by the police as a suspect in the initial kidnapping of Gil Jamison. He wrote a statement that was published in another Japanese newspaper, the Nippujiji, in which he detailed how the chief of detectives, a guy named John McIntosh, had punched him in his stomach, punched him on his side so that no bruises would be left, trying to get him to confess to a crime which he had not committed. Kidnapping of Gil Jamison was huge news in Honolulu. When Tuesday evening, following the kidnapping that morning, an extra edition of the Honolulu Star Bulletin informed people of what had happened to young Gil. But this headline is from Sunday morning, following Fukunaga's capture and confession the previous evening. The newspapers would publish in the first 2-3 weeks after the crime 10 to 12 articles about the case, certainly featured on their front pages. So note in this edition of the newspaper, they're already referring to Fukunaga as the slayer, as the murderer of Gil Jamison, even though he had not been put on trial, and that he had made a full confession about killing him. The reference to the mob that you see here is because people started showing up Wednesday already after news of Gil Jamison's kidnapping had been printed in the newspapers, at the police station, and at the Hawaiian Trust Company, so that they could get the most recent news about what had happened to Gil. So following Fukunaga's arrest, this news spread very quickly throughout Honolulu, such that thousands of people gathered at the police station. And the police were very concerned that this large mob might storm the police station, abduct Fukunaga, and then lynch him. And therefore they roped off several blocks surrounding the police station, brought out police fire wagons to hose the crowd whenever people got too close to the police station. Fred Makina was the publisher of the Hawaii Hochi newspaper. that took up the Fukunaga campaign for a new trial and a full psychiatric exam. So Fred Makino, in talking about the case, often referred to there being two kinds of justice in Hawaii, one for whites and the other for Japanese Americans and other people of color. Fukunaga's killing of Gil did not occur in a racial vacuum in the 1920s. This decade was the height of the anti-Japanese movement in Hawaii, led by the military, the territorial government, and the big five companies that dominated the Hawaii economy. All of these are predominantly Hawaii institutions. The anti-Japanese campaign sought to subordinate Japanese Americans, keep them in their place, because they were viewed as the most threatening group to continued Haole supremacy in Hawaii. Politically threatening, for example, because they vastly outnumbered whites in Hawaii, more than 40% of the population in the 1920s. And a majority of Japanese Americans by the mid-1920s were US citizens born in Hawaii, like Fukunaga. So Haoles knew they would be able to control the vote once they became of age, which was going to be by the 1930s. Whites also feared that Japanese Americans would be able to, well, not necessarily take over the sugar industry, but would cause them great financial problems because of the strikes they had organized since the turn of the century, and very large strikes in 1909, and another one at the start of the 1920s decade. So in my book, it's titled Race to Death, I use race with two different meanings. The first is the more conventional meaning of a racial group. So Fukunaga, rather than being prosecuted as an individual without regard to race, was viewed by Haoles, by whites, as a Japanese person who had violated this racial boundary between Japanese Americans and whites by killing a young Haole boy. The only worst crime he could have committed at this time was if he had raped and killed a young Haole girl. The other meaning I give to race in the title of my book is that I argue Fukunaga was rushed very quickly to his death sentence, arrested, put on trial, convicted, sentenced to death, a little more than 2 weeks after killing Gil Jamison. His execution was scheduled actually for October 23rd, which, if it had taken place, would have been less than 5 weeks after he had killed Gil. My focus, as I said in my book, is on racial injustice in the Fukunaga case. I'm just going to mention some of the more blatant examples that occurred in the case. Fukunaga was very likely mentally insane, but we cannot really know because he was not given a full psychiatric exam. It was just 90 minutes long by 3 court-appointed psychiatrists, as opposed to being 10 days in length, which was the practice in Hawaii and which was in accordance with law. But these 3 psychiatrists, after speaking with Fukunaga, certified he was legally sane. And the judge accepted their report, even though he knew that it only took 90 minutes to conduct it. Regarding this issue of his mental sanity, after the trial, the Hawaii Ho-Chi newspaper approached a Navy psychiatrist, Dr. Thompson, based at Pearl Harbor, and asked him if he had an opinion about Fukunaga's sanity or insanity. So Thompson said, well, I've been following the trial, I've been reading the trial testimony, I've read Fukunaga's confession, and I believe he's mentally insane. He listed a number of psychiatric problems he thought Fukunaga suffered from, including being paranoid and psychotic. And he was then asked, well, would you be willing to submit an affidavit on Fukunaga's behalf to the court so that we can appeal his conviction and ask for a new trial? And Thompson agreed. But at the hearing, the judge pointed out that Thompson, while he stated in the affidavit that Fukunaga was mentally insane, he did not state that he was legally insane. And I'll get to that difference shortly. The jury that convicted Fukunaga was highly biased against him. When asked, either by the prosecution or the defense attorneys, if they had an opinion about Fukunaga's guilt or innocence, most of them said they indeed did have an opinion. They could not actually be asked what that opinion was. But then they said they would add, well, yes, but I can remove my opinion about the case and give Fukunaga a fair and impartial trial. Or I already have removed that opinion from my mind. This is highly doubtful because there was so much publicity about the case and people were talking about it in Honolulu on a daily basis, that they had almost surely had to believe he was guilty. He had also confessed to his crime. There was one Japanese American on the jury named Shinchi Maruyama, who was the English language editor of the Nippujiji newspaper, the rival newspaper of the Hawaii Hochi. The publisher of the Nippujiji newspaper, Yasutaro Soga, and Fred Makino were bitter enemies at this time. Maruyama obviously knew how his employer, Soga, wanted him to vote on this question of Fukunaga's guilt or innocence, and therefore he voted for Fukunaga being guilty. Other examples of racial injustice. Fukunaga's court-appointed attorneys, who were well-established attorneys. One was the former US Marshal for Hawaii. They were not incompetent necessarily or very newly admitted to the bar, but nonetheless, they provided just a 19-minute defense. They called no witnesses on his behalf. Who might they have called? They could have called his parents, his uncle, his former work supervisors, his former teachers, all of whom, when questioned by the press, said that Miles Fukunaga, they knew, they can't believe he would have committed such a brutal murder. They knew Fukunaga to be very mild-mannered, quiet, having a meek personality, someone who had never done anything rough in his life, who had never been in trouble before at school or at work. So that's the question that needs to be answered in this case. How could someone with such a very different background commit such a violent murder? The trial itself just took 2 days. The first day, the prosecution presented its case. The second day, Fukunaga's defense attorneys took over. But the afternoon of the first day, they stipulated that Fukunaga had killed Gil. But subsequently, they provided no defense, such as, well, he was legally insane at that time. Reading the court transcript, I think by the afternoon of the first day of the trial, Fukunaga's attorneys were also seeking to have him raised to death. The morning of the first day, they would raise objections, they would cross-examine witnesses, but by the afternoon of that first day, they stopped that practice. and they would make stipulations for the benefit of the prosecution, such as, well, do I really have to read Fukunaga's ransom letter into the evidence, as the prosecution would say? And then the Fukunaga's defense attorneys would respond, we will stipulate that the ransom letter has been read into evidence. The judge was also guilty of racial injustice. In his instructions to the jury, he provided them a definition of legal insanity according to the 1925 Hawaii Insanity Act, just 3 years before the Fukunaga case. So insanity, he told them, means that one cannot, well, sanity means that one cannot, or can differentiate rather, between right and wrong. In other words, if you're legally insane, you cannot make that differentiation. I'm sure in just about every state in America, this is the primary criterion for being considered legally sane, that one can distinguish between right and wrong. What another observer of the trial noted was that the judge did not provide another criterion of being considered legally insane in Hawaii at that time. So UH professor Lockwood Myrick was following the case, and he wrote what he called an open letter to Governor Wallace Farrington on Fukunaga's insanity. But this is much more than a letter. It's an academic study, more than 40 pages of printed text. He conducted research for this paper, interviewed Fukunaga's parents, some of the psychiatrists who had evaluated Fukunaga, talked to his defense attorneys, spoke with his former employers and teachers. And he concluded that Fukunaga was legally insane because he was compelled by this force he could not resist, which led him to kill Gil. And this force was his desire for revenge against the Hawaiian Trust Company because of that very contentious encounter with the rent collector. But this other criterion for being considered legally insane in Hawaii was not brought up by the judge, by the prosecution, by the 3 psychiatrists who interviewed Fukunaga, and by his own defense attorneys. Now, in my book, to emphasize the historical significance of the Fukunaga case, I connect it to other major incidences of racial injustice in the 1920s and into the early 1930s. I argue that it was just part of this much larger trajectory of racial injustice that began earlier in the 1920s with the arrest and conviction of Japanese and Filipino labor leaders. They were convicted of conspiracy charges or based on perjured testimony, in some cases paid for by the sugar planters, sent to prison anywhere from 4 to 7 years. When paroled, none of them ever engaged in any labor organizing activities. Some of them returned to Japan, others returned to the Philippines, which is the reason why the planters wanted to have them sent to prison. Following the Fukunaga case, almost exactly 3 years later, Thalia Massey, the 20-year-old white wife of a Navy lieutenant based at Pearl Harbor, accused 5 men from Hawaii, young men from Hawaii, including Joe Kahawai, of raping her. But this could not have been the case because they were across town, Honolulu, when she said this crime had been committed. So the jury was hung, could not come to a verdict, and a mistrial was declared by the judge. But Thalia Massey's husband, Tommy, her mother, 2 sailors, kidnapped Joe Kahawai in January 1932. about a month after the mistrial was declared, and shot him to death. They were put on trial for manslaughter instead of first-degree murder, and there was clear evidence of premeditation in this case. They were convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to 10 years at hard labor, but then had their sentences commuted to 1 hour in custody. Because the evening prior to their sentencing, an agreement was struck between their attorney, Clarence Darrow, probably the most famous criminal defense attorney in America at that time, the prosecutor, the judge, and the governor of Hawaii, who agreed that he would commute their sentence to 1 hour, which took place immediately after their sentencing, and all of them left Hawaii within 1 week. So the Unequal Hawai case clearly brings out how Haule's whites could literally get away with murder in Hawaii. It also confirms the racial significance of the Fukunaga case because of its close connection to the Massey case, Unequal Hawai case, and also the earlier cases of the labor leaders being sent to prison to remove them so that Haole supremacy could continue in Hawaii. Oh, I'll end there. And mahalo for listening to my presentation, and I'll take some of your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Okamura. This is that was a really wonderful presentation, very disturbing. Tells us about a really important chapter in, well, not just Japanese American history, but in the whole history of race relations in this country, one that I didn't know about until I actually, knowing that this was coming up, I bought your book and I've been reading it. And let me mention to everybody that it's an eminently readable book. I mean, I haven't gotten very far into it, but it is of course scholarly, but it's really, really readable. I think you pitched it to the general reader. And so I would encourage everyone to read it. It's most interesting. I think it gives us a really good balance. When we today in the 21st century think about Hawaii, it's probably one of everyone's favorite places to vacation, and it's beautiful. And then for people like myself, we go there, and they're just visually, the diversity is so obvious, if you will, okay? The kind of diversity that we don't get here, even in Southern California, where there are a lot more, there's a lot more diversity than in other parts of the country. We tend to look at Hawaii as sort of a racial, I don't know, something approaching paradise, not entirely. We're too realistic to realize that. And yet to know this, but we know that it hasn't always been the case. If you know anything about Japanese American history, just broadly speaking, we know that's not the case. But this has given us a truly great, concrete evidence of that. I wonder, let's see, I don't think we have, I wonder if I might start us off with a couple of questions while we wait for people to type in questions into the, let me again encourage people to type in your questions into the Q&A box. But you do describe the early on in the book, I think it's in your introduction, you describe the racial hierarchy in Hawaii in the very early 20th century, and of course you referred to it in your talk. But first of all, at the top, of course, were the Haules, which you do describe. I mean, right now we make the equivalency with white, but of course you point out that at the time it was not necessarily white, partly because in the Hawaiian language, Haole meant just someone who was a stranger, right, or a foreigner. and also because the Portuguese people who, there were, waves of immigration from Portugal, they were from Europe and therefore, quote unquote white, but they were not racialized as white. They were not considered Haole at the time. But the thing that I found interesting was that early on in the early 20th century, there was an alliance between the Haoles and the Native Hawaiians politically. Now, the Native Hawaiians certainly did not benefit necessarily economically from it, but they were allied politically because the Haoles needed their votes, right? And so there's and then, all the other groups were sort of, I guess they were ranked order beneath them. Could you talk a little bit about, is there a racial hierarchy still in Hawaii? I'm guessing yes, perhaps not quite so, blatant and obvious, but I wonder if you could speak to that today. I mean, is there one, and what would it look like? What does it look like? If it's not too sensitive.
I tend to use the term ethnic hierarchy rather than racial hierarchy.
Yes.
In Hawaii. The reason is because I think of ethnicity as much more significant than race in Hawaii as an organizing principle of our society. People don't talk about race in Hawaii as they do on the continent. For example, we don't commonly invoke the term Asian American because we distinguish among different Asian American groups, Chinese American, Filipino American, Japanese American, etc. Those terms, there is definitely an ethnic hierarchy, and Hawaiians are not the only group. At the top of that hierarchy, they share that position with Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans. Another Asian American group, or more than one actually, Filipino Americans and Vietnamese Americans are among the subordinate groups in Hawaii, along with Hawaiians and Samoans and other Pacific Islander groups. This is the ethnic hierarchy.
I see.
There's a very wide gap between the three dominant groups and these other subordinate groups. And that gap for me has been widening since the 1970s, after tourism became established as the dominant industry in Hawaii in the 60s. Tourism provides largely service and sales job, low paying, low wage, and as brought up by the pandemic, clearly low security. Literally tens of thousands of tourist industry workers have lost their jobs, which have the highest unemployment rate in the nation. And therefore, the other problem is tourism is the dominant industry. It's the major source of state tax revenues, which fund our public schools. Public schools receive no funding from local property taxes, totally dependent on the state legislature for their appropriations. So as the tourism industry declines, and has it done as it's done regularly over the decades, the public schools suffer with less funding. We have the huge underfunding problem. Shortage of teachers, evident every year when the schools open. So over time, what happened in the post-World War II period is Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans separated themselves from that block of non-Haole groups evident in the pre-World War II period. And this gave rise to ethnicity being the dominant organizing principle.
On the same line, also large companies started heading to Hawaii after post-war. And could you talk a little bit down the same line, talk a little bit about that, Dole, Pineapple, and all the financial institutions that moved over there and boomed during that time, and the influence they had on the island itself, on the islands themselves.
Well, the pineapple companies were started earlier at the turn of the century. Sugar plantation started also much earlier in the 19th century. Perhaps the economic boom that you're talking about is post-statehood, after 1959. The 60s is a period of economic boom in Hawaii. That's when companies based on the continent set up subsidiaries in Hawaii. This is how Barack Obama came to be born in Hawaii, because his grandfather was working for a company that established a branch in the island on Oahu. And his grandfather said, well, I'll move to Hawaii. And he took along his wife and 18-year-old daughter, who enrolled as a freshman at our university in the fall of 1959, met her husband-to-be in a Russian language class, and they got married subsequently, and that's how Barack Obama was born in Hawaii in 1963, I believe. But that was the period in which tourism became the dominant industry, providing jobs that were much more desirable than working outside in the plantation fields, pineapple or sugar. But as I said, there are also problems with tourism itself, the wages paid to workers. And most tourism industry workers are non-union. If you work for a unionized hotel in Waikiki, you can do the same job, let's say operate the same dishwashing machine and get twice the salary of a dishwasher in a non-unionized hotel. So no question, there was this economic boom that occurred. Companies moved to Hawaii, but tourism became the dominant industry. At this point, we've known this for decades. We need to diversify the economy because of the kinds of jobs that are created in which the workforce tends to be people of color, especially immigrants. Now it's Filipino immigrants, the largest group employed in the tourist industry. That also maintains the ethnic hierarchy, the kinds of jobs we have available in our service-oriented economy.
There's a question that sort of follows up along the same lines. Stan, you may have seen this also, but from Jeremy actually. Can you share a little bit about the events in the past year in Hawaii in terms of race and police violence? Have protests there reflected those throughout the US, and or do they have distinctive aspects? So if you could.
Well, there have been a couple of recent incidences, maybe just the past maybe 3 weeks, one in which a 16-year-old Micronesian was shot and killed by the police. Micronesians are the group that's most subject to racism in Hawaii now. They started coming in significant numbers to Hawaii, maybe in the 1990s. They have the legal right to settle in Hawaii as a result of what's called the Compacts of Free Association. Technically, they're not immigrants, because they have the right to settle, to work, to go to school in Hawaii. But there's extreme racism directed against them. Challenging this idea you mentioned earlier about Hawaii as a racial paradise. Some of the most vile jokes, because in Hawaii we have this sort of tradition of ethnic humor, but there are these extremely racist jokes told about Micronesians online or by comedians that represent them as less than human. And they're subject to violence in the public schools also. So this is how some people have viewed this incident in which the 16-year-old Micronesian youth was killed in a police pursuit. He was with several other Micronesian youths. They had been engaged in what the police would say was a crime spree the past several days. Questions have been raised about that killing and for the release of any video footage about his shooting. The other case, which occurred maybe a week ago, was of a South African who had moved to Hawaii with his wife, who's a white person, and he was shot by the police. This was captured on video footage after going to this home, and someone there called 911. The police showed up, and without identifying themselves as police, they told him to get down, get down. So he attacked them, was in a fight with them when another officer shot him to death. But people are definitely concerned about these kinds of incidences involving people of color as victims by the police. And there has been concern expressed previously about the number of police shootings in Hawaii.
One of the things that we've experienced here is, of course, the anti-Asian incidents. But I was wondering if that has also had a manifestation in Hawaii as well?
No, not really. You know, I haven't heard of any major kinds of incidents or any incidents really. There have been protests about stop anti-Asian hate. And unfortunately, I wouldn't use the term AAPI because, you know, the question I raised, what Pacific Islanders have been assaulted or even killed or blamed for the spread of the coronavirus to the United States? But, you know, I've been talking about this issue over the past couple of weeks, and I bring up, well, we don't have these incidents of anti-Asian hate and violence, but we certainly do have anti-Haole violence and racism. They're the group, and also Micronesians, who have really been subject to these kinds of violent incidences, beaten up because they're Haole or Micronesian. Going back over the decades, they're regularly harassed, picked on. Fights started with them, especially places like Waikiki, where different groups of people gather regularly, especially on the weekends, involving military also. And so I raised the issue, well, how about stopping anti-Haole violence, anti-Micronesian violence and racism? Since we don't necessarily have a problem at this time with anti-Asian violence.
Do you mean that Haoles are beaten up just because they are Haoles?
According to my students, yes, and I don't deny them. And also because people pick fights with them.
I see.
Or there are other incidents that have occurred, like one well-known incident was in 2007 when a military couple parked their car and they accidentally dinged another car, and they identified as Hawaiian, and the son got out of the car, started beating up the Haole couple, including a woman now, a young wife. And as they were doing this, they're referring to them as effing Haoles. But this was not prosecuted as a hate crime because according to the prosecutor's office, the reason for this violent incident, the assault, was the traffic accident, the dinging of their car, and not because they were Haole. The intent behind it. And this is the problem with the term hate crime.
I see.
On the same lines, I taught a diversity class for my fire department. And when you talk about diversity, one of the questions I had asked the participants were all firemen. And I said, have you ever been discriminated against and so on? And one of the individuals did raise his hand, and he said he grew up in the military as a military brat and in Hawaii, and he was a Haole boy and he was a surfer. And he said they would block him from getting waves and so on and so on. And my response was, and then, so you were a Haole boy, and what does that mean? And he said it was a mainlander. That's how he described it, as being a mainlander. Mm-hmm. And so I said, so when you came back to America, you're white, and are you discriminated against now? And he said no. And I said, so think about the people that are discriminated against daily and can't change their complexion or their look, and they can't come to America and everything goes away. And so I understand that there are problems over there, but I think there's bigger problems the way the Hawaiians were and have been treated over the many years too. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Oh yeah, sure. Historically, because of the overthrow of the monarchy, if we go back to 1893 and the subsequent annexation of Hawaii by the United States 5 years later, not through the approval of the Senate, but through a resolution, which only required a majority vote as opposed to the 60 votes that would be required for Treaty of Annexation. That resulted in the US colonizing Hawaii, formally colonizing Hawaii and taking over Native Hawaiian land. So what's called the Ceded Lands Trust, what remains of it is about 1.4 million acres, but much of the land seized by the US government was used for the military. So on the island where I am, Oahu, about 23% of the land is controlled by the US military for bases. It's like facilities such as those. But this is called the Ceded Lands Trust. When Hawaii became a state, what was left from the lands that were taken over by the US government was turned over to the state of Hawaii, ceded to the state of Hawaii. But even before that, the territorial government had been using this land for public purposes. So the University of Hawaii, public schools, hospitals, airports, the docks, they all are on ceded lands, originally controlled, owned by Hawaiians. But now the government, state government and federal government controls those lands. So this is a very contentious issue, still ongoing between the state government and the Native Hawaiian community. But it's that kind of dispossession that leads to subordination also, and why Hawaiians are among the most disadvantaged groups socioeconomically in Hawaii.
Thank you. One of the questions here was internment camps, and how did that affect Hawaii when America in the 40s, when the internment camps were placed in the United States? How did that affect the islands?
Well, there were a much smaller number of Japanese who were interned. In Hawaii, 1,500. There was one major internment camp, Honouliuli, on this island. But there were smaller camps on every island. About 1,900 Japanese were sent from Hawaii to the US continent, to the internment camps there. The number was small because, as I said, Japanese American population was very large, the largest group in Hawaii at the time of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The military, actually earlier, in the 1920s, the military had already written a report in which they developed plans in the event of war with Japan. The plans included the declaration of martial law and limited internment of those Japanese thought to be most untrustworthy. So in Hawaii, those who were interned were primarily Japanese aliens. On the continent, 2/3 of those interned were US citizens. And so, and those who were interned were very well known. Buddhist priests, Shinto priests, Japanese school teachers, principals, community leaders. So once they were picked up by the military or the FBI, that news spread very quickly throughout the Japanese community. And it was like a warning. Don't do anything suspicious or the same thing might happen to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was, well, I had some questions myself, but there's one question that I'm not quite sure the point of it, well, not quite sure how to interpret it, but there's a question about the role of religion in Hawaiian culture, but perhaps maybe if the questioner doesn't mind my turning it just a little bit, have some of the churches, how have they played into, or have they played a role at all in the things that we are talking about, in the ethnic hierarchy, in the subjugation of certain of the groups? Have the churches or religion itself played a part? Stan, I don't know if I could interpret this even any other way.
I was thinking this, what they were thinking of, Hawaiians and the Pacific Islanders have a different type of religion, and even you said that this young man was took on the Catholic religion once he was arrested, and I think they're asking, how has religion, the Islander religions, influenced Hawaii?
The traditional Hawaiian religion?
Mm-hmm, the traditional Hawaiian religion.
Well, still, Hawaiian beliefs, values, religious values still persist, but the missionaries converted many Hawaiians to Congregational Protestantism. This is the dominant religion over time in Hawaii. That many Hawaiians joined that church. And the Congregational Protestant churches in Hawaii, maybe this was in the 1990s, did return some of the land that they had acquired from Hawaiians and donated it back. I'm not sure to which Hawaiian community group or agency they did that. But they're the only group I know that has made that sort of gesture in terms, especially of land, returning it to Hawaiians for land that was, that they took over, let's say, from Hawaiian.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have another question?
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I had a couple of questions about the newspapers. Going back to the original, the Fukunaga case, I was really interested to learn about the opposing sides taken by, on the one hand, the Nippujiji and the Hawaii Hoji. And I was wondering, was there a similar opinion? I mean, one was advocating for a retrial, perhaps a mistrial, et cetera. But the other one thought that, no, it was a fair trial. It was, non-racial, not biased, et cetera. Was there a similar opinion divide in the community among in the Japanese community in Hawaii?
Oh, yeah. Soga, the publisher of the Nippujiji, was allied with a Japanese Christian minister, Reverend Okamura. They were accommodationists to the dominant policies, as opposed to the position taken by Makino. So whenever new laws were passed, for example, to restrict the operations of the Japanese language schools, Soga and Reverend Okamura said, well, we should comply. We should be good citizens and not challenge these laws, as opposed to what Makino did. In fact, they challenged the laws and in local courts, and the territorial Hawaii went ultimately to the US Supreme Court to have the verdicts overturned, unsuccessfully. Soga and Reverend Okamura organized something called the New Americans Conference because they wanted young Nisei, like Fukunaga's age, to meet with Haole business, military, educational, professional leaders at this annual New Americans Conference, where they would be given speeches by these Haole leaders, including by the president of the University of Hawai, who told them, well, don't come to the university and expect to advance yourself as a result of getting a college degree.
That's strange.
Okamura, yeah, I know. If the president of the university said that this time, they would be fired. Reverend Okamura talked about, farming is inbred among Japanese. You from plantation communities should stay there on the plantation.
Wow.
This is called the Back to the Plantation movement. So Reverend Okamura, Soga, and other Japanese community leaders were, as I said, accommodationists. They didn't want to challenge Haole rule, as opposed to Fred Makino and his supporters. So yes, there was a very clear division in the Japanese community which was reflected in the division between the two newspapers. Although in the case of the Fukunaga crime, the community sided for the most part, overwhelmingly, with the position taken by Makino and the Hawaii Ochi newspaper. That's why 6,000 people showed up at that gathering. The subscriptions to the Nipujiji declined substantially in the fall of 1928 because of the official position that the Nipujiji expressed in its editorials that Fukunaga should be hanged for his crime.
There's a lot of history and a lot of parallel history too to African Americans. I know you were talking about the incarceration of Japanese and Hawaiians, and was because of you said in 10 years they would have the power of the vote. And I know in the South it was much the same. They would incarcerate African American males because they knew the numbers were getting high enough to where they too would have the power of the vote. Can you speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, okay. After Hawaii became officially a territory in 1900, the first territorial elections were held. The party that won was neither Democrat or Republican, home rulers. It was a party of Native Hawaiians who advocated the return of Queen Liliuokalani to the throne. She had been overthrown in 1893. So they were elected a majority of the new territorial legislature. One person, one vote meant Hawaiians were hugely disadvantaged because there were such a small population, 5–6% in Hawaii at that time. So the Hawaii leaders said, we gotta fix this problem. And the solution was, let's form a political alliance with Hawaiians, the largest group of voters. Japanese Americans were the largest group, but most of them at that time were not US citizens. There were some, but they were too young to vote, not 21 at that time. So the Hawaiis made this formal agreement with Prince Kuhio, one of the last remaining royalty in the Hawaiian community, and said, well, get your people to support Hawaii Republican candidates for office, and we'll give you patronage jobs in the territorial and county governments, which, as I said, how so many Hawaiians became police officers, firefighters. And we will also support Hawaiian candidates for the territorial legislature if they run as Republican, not as home rulers. So the home rule party just collapsed within 10 years. They had no representatives in the territorial legislature. And unfortunately, though, by aligning themselves with the Hawaiis, who they outnumbered in the territorial legislature, Hawaiians lost the political power they otherwise would have had. They were the largest group in the legislature, not all Republicans, though there's some Democrats, until the 1930s, when more Japanese Americans started to get elected.
Wow.
So that's
and was that seen as a sellout?
well, it depends how you frame that, right? You know.
Yeah,
that's a tough one, huh?
Yeah. You don't want to necessarily criticize people.
No, I understand.
Kinds of actions that they took at that time.
I just want to thank Dean Cabreros for joining us today. Dean, did you have any questions?
You're muted. Cesar, do you want to unmute yourself? I guess not.
Okay.
Okay. There was a question actually from Robbie. Were there instances of spectacle lynching of non-whites in Hawaii? I guess the way there were for Blacks in the South.
No, I don't think so. They were held within the prison, one prison.
Okay.
At that time, people gathered outside, but they could not directly witness. I can add, I've also done research on capital punishment in Hawaii. we abolished capital punishment in 1957. Capital punishment was also highly racialized. Only one white person was executed in Hawaii when we still had executions, capital punishment. Also, only one Hawaiian. And has been explained as a result of that alliance between Hawaiians and Hawaiians. Haole leaders would intervene, like the governor, and commute the sentence of a Hawaiian who had been convicted of first-degree murder, such that they would not be hanged. The group that was hanged the most were Filipinos.
Wow.
They were racially demonized as prone to violence and crime historically in Hawaii. 24 of the 42 persons executed were Filipino, majority when they represented 1/6 of the population. So once the Democrats took over in 1954, they immediately submitted bills to abolish capital punishment in the 55 legislative session. But this became more official in 1957 when we were still a territory. But the abolition of capital punishment was also racialized because the Democrats were supported largely by non-whites. They recognized that most of those who were hanged were non-white also.
It's fascinating.
And I had one other question I've been holding for a long time, and that is the military influence in Hawaii over the years, because there's a large military representation on the islands. So how have they affected how Hawaii functions?
Well, military spending is the second largest industry in Hawaii after tourism. I recently saw a figure. I was surprised it was still that high. 3,600 workers, civilian workers at Pearl Harbor. Very good paying jobs. I imagine it used to be much higher before, but it is, Pearl Harbor is a base for maintenance of ships and refitting, etc. But some of these jobs, like in engineering, electrical engineering, one of my friends, his son, graduated with an electrical engineering degree, and he, at 23 years old, he's making six-figure income.
Wow.
Pearl Harbor, so much overtime. But they are certainly a large contributor to the economy. In terms of ethnic relations, race relations, a lot of animosity towards the military, blacks, whites, Latinos, and these, because they're young men primarily, and they encounter other local young men in places like Waikiki or the bases, or like what the person you met who told you about surfing spots. That is still true to this day. Certain surfing areas on this island, I know better than the neighbor islands, they're for locals only, as they would say. So white persons go surfing there at their own risk. And there are these violent encounters. One of my students, he told me about what he did to a Haole student who came out surfing where he surfed. What the hell did you have to do that for? I mean, wow. What does this mean? Why are you telling me this story? You're trying to impress me about what you did? Don't you think it's rather stupid? You're a college student. Don't you think you know better than to get into a fight with a Haole guy over surfing? Aren't there enough waves? Can't you share the waves? And then he apologized. But that stuff still goes on.
Wow, I'd heard that. I'd heard there was some local beaches, local surf areas, and strictly for the locals. And you substantiated that. That's fantastic. I thought it was a old wives' tale that they had those certain areas. Wow.
Yeah. There used to be this saying among Haoles, never go ever. The west side. Don't go to the west side of the island.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's kind of like the racialization of space.
Yeah, it is.
Dr. Okamura, thank you so much for joining us today. Did you have, Ari, did you have any more questions?
Well, there was one quick one that got typed in just now, which is sort of going back a definition of Hawaiian. How do you define a Hawaiian? Those born in Hawaii, if they're Polynesian descent or
Okay. Well, the term in the Hawaiian language, which some Hawaiians use and it's become increasingly more popular, is kanaka Maoli. Maoli, Polynesian term for people, like the native people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Maori people. It's a related term. Kanaka means person or people. So the real or true people of Hawaii are the kanaka Maoli. This term has been used to express the identity and status of Native Hawaiians because of the way that non-Hawaiians claim Hawaiian to be Hawaiian. They redefine the term Hawaiian, even though they lack Hawaiian ancestry, to mean, anyone born and raised in Hawaii.
So
it's supposedly a Hawaiian, which most people in Hawaii would not accept. They understand that Native Hawaiians are the native people of Hawaii, not someone who was born and raised in Hawaii. Being Hawaiian does not mean the same thing as, say, being a Californian. That you were born and raised, or you live in California, or you're a resident of California.
I see. So you have to have an ancestry back to the original peoples of Hawaii.
That is state law.
Wow.
It's written in our Constitution, 1978.
Wow.
Let me answer.
So Barack Obama will not be Hawaiian.
No.
Well, he represented himself as both Pacific Islander and Asian American, when he campaigned first time.
Interesting.
He asked a question about what's written on Fukunaga's gravestone. Well, I've asked several of my Japanese friends. One of them told me, and this is not a literal translation, but she said it could be translated to mean this is the gravesite of a person who committed a misdeed. There are three characters, three kanji.
Yeah.
Wow.
Gravestone.
I tried to read it myself. The third or final character just means like grave or monument. But I couldn't see clearly the second character. Do you happen to know what that character means? Okay, because it was not his name. Yeah, it was not his name.
No.
Yeah.
The base of the gravestone has his Buddhist name, because they give him another name. It doesn't say Maos Fukunaga.
Yeah, right.
Well, I'll send it to you, Eddie.
Oh,
because people, sometimes they give me very different translations. Yeah. And there are friends of mine who are completely fluent in both English and Japanese. They studied abroad, and so they're able to read the kanji. The one that this graduate student told me was the one that made the most sense about the grave site of someone and you've confirmed that it does say kind of grave site, right? Of someone who committed a misdeed.
Okay, I'm going to write that down and see, and I'll take a look at it when you send it to me.
Okay, I'd appreciate it. Yeah, if you could send me.
I'm curious
what
too.
You think it is?
Maybe one last question.
Is there one?
Oh, one from. Do you think that generational trauma plays into the interactions between natives, the Hawaiians toward Haoles?
This is one of those issues where I think I raised an issue such as anti-Haole violence because they get blamed for things for the problems that we have in Hawaii. And sometimes they get blamed because of the overthrow, which of course had lasting consequences in Hawaiians. But over time, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans have also risen in political and economic status and power in Hawaii. Therefore, holidays are not the only group that we should blame necessarily for the subordination of Hawaiians. But that's the reason for, I believe, the picking fights with holidays. As opposed to trying to address those issues in other kinds of ways.
I see.
At the same time, you touched on, and it's true, large numbers of young men in the military were brought over there, and when they have shore leave, you know, that there's a whole different air in the air when there's, you know, 300 non-Hawaiians walking up and down the streets of Waikiki. And so it does change the climate, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, you know, that's an issue now. Still yet. There are these beaches, well, on Maui, where these large gatherings are being held without masks. You know, in Hawaii, it's still state law in Hawaii. You have to wear a mask in public if you cannot maintain 6 feet distance. But these are characterized in the media as largely attended by whites. These parties on the beach, you know, open violation of state law. The police really aren't enforcing the law. They go there and ask people to clear out, but they don't necessarily arrest anyone. But it's another manifestation of what you just mentioned. You know? Large whites gathering together and creating a commotion, whatever.
Okay. Well, how about maybe one, it's sort of a plug for next week, but also there's a question in here from Jeremy, if I may. Next week, we'll be hearing from experts on the war on drugs and drug raids. And he's heard that cannabis growing is a major potential moneymaker in Hawaii, sometimes in a legal gray area due to conflicting state and national laws. Do you know whether the policing of this industry continues to be a racialized sledgehammer for law enforcement there? So that's a question.
To what extent it's racialized, you know, but there are these kind of estimates of how much money the state could make if they tax the industry based on the sales. There are sales of medicinal marijuana allowed in Hawaii, but if the sales that go on in other situations, places like Waikiki regularly, who are being controlled more so, the income for the state would be substantial, apparently. I don't know much about grades, you know, because these are held in, you know, the growing takes place in rural areas, you know, on the sides of mountains, under trees, allowing for some sunlight to get in.
And on private property, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it could be private or it could be up in the mountains, you know, where it's technically public land still, yeah. Hard to reach places too, huh? Only accessible by a helicopter or more easily accessible using a helicopter than hiking out.
Wow.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okamura.
Oh, thank you.
For joining us today. Very interesting subject matter, and we appreciate it, and hopefully we'll get you back to talk on the same type of issue with a full panel of people that have similar stories. Just a most amazing story you brought to us today, and I will get the book and read it also. Eri, you have anything else to add?
Just to say thank you, Dr. Okamura. This was most enlightening, and you know, filled huge gaps in, I think, our everyone's knowledge base about Hawaii. So thank you so very much. I mean, a lot more questions. Maybe I'll email them to you if you don't mind. Okay. So,
no, thanks very much for inviting me and for your questions. I very much appreciate participating in your colloquium series and having the opportunity to meet with you today and sharing our ideas together, having this discussion as we've had. So Very best wishes to all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yuri, you want to close us out with the students?
Meaning,
Just thank them for being here.
That's right. Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm new at this, okay? Thanks to everybody. And thanks to the students, especially those of you who are here to the bitter end, so to speak. A lot of people had to leave for other classes, of course, I know that. But I think there's we have a way to send the rosters to the instructors, and so they will know that you were here. So thank you to the other panelists. Thank you so much, Stan. I had fun.
Yeah, well, it's fun every week. So you can sit in on it and watch us every week. It's a wonderful learning experience. I've learned so much over the year, and students have too. And I thank the students for being here too. Like you said, to the bitter end, just a lot of information being shared. Thank you again.